Hello everyone and welcome to an incredibly wild game from round 7 of the Meltwater Champions Chester Finals. It's Magnus Carlsen versus Teimour Radjabov well, this game has it all, and most importantly, as the title suggests, it's a game that was played between StockFish and AlphaZero in their famous match in 2017 in London that you guys have seen. So let's see what this game is all about. Magnus has the white pieces and he opens with e4. We have e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and the bishop to b5, going for the Ruy Lopez. And nowadays, everyone just goes for the Berlin defense. We have knight to f6, and Magnus says, we're not going to trade anything, just d3, and we're playing a game. We have bishop to c5, and now bishop captures on c6. Much like he played against Nakamura, we have d captures on c6, and now Magnus castles. And now, if you remember, we mentioned that you can defend this pawn in a variety of ways. You can go knight to d7, queen to e7, you can bring the bishop back to d6 like Nakamura did. But here we have knight to d7, this is the line that Radjabov chooses, and now c3, making a room for this pawn to be pushed to d4 to grab more space in the center. Radjabov castles, and now d4. Magnus strikes in the center, and now bishop to d6. So nicely keeping an eye on that e5 pawn. We have bishop to g5, and here you have to defend somehow. Your queen is attacked, and you could play f6, or you could bring the queen to e8. Wesley So played f6 here many times in this position with great success. He won some games, he drew some games. I don't think he ever lost a game. The win in this position with f6 was against Alireza Firouzja, but Radjabov goes queen to e8, and it's not a bad move. It's the move that AlphaZero played in the match against StockFish. We have rook to e1, and now in the match against StockFish also played rook to e1, and AlphaZero played f6 in this position, but Radjabov plays c5, so he improves on AlphaZero's move, and it is now as of move 10 that we have a completely new game. So there's a lot of pressure on the center, but Magnus has this covered, so he continues with the development of his queen side. Knight can now come to c2, you could also come to c4, attack the bishop, you could come to b5, all depending on what black plays. So Radjabov captures in the center once, we have c captures, and only now f6, chasing away this bishop, bishop to h4, and now knight to b6, controlling c4 here, and bishop to g3 now by Magnus. We have bishop to g4, pinning the knight, and Magnus just moves the queen, unpins, and delivers check. So queen to b3 check, king to h8, and now knight to b5, putting pressure on the bishop here. So here bishop captures on f3 first, now asking, do you want to capture with the queen? So I grab the knight on b5, or do you want to mess up your king side? So Magnus has to mess up the king side. He plays g captures on f3, and now rook to d8. Now you are ready to recapture if needed, even with the pawn, and then you will have a nice pawn mass in the center. So rook 8 to c1, Magnus putting more pressure on the c7 square, and now queen to e7. Radjabov just defends it. We have a4 now, preparing to dislodge the knight with a5. So knight to c8. Now the idea is, if knight captures on d6 and you're threatening to pick up the b7 pawn, the knight can capture, and now the b7 pawn is defended. So instead we have rook e to d1, and now a6, forcing Magnus to either move or capture on d6. So Magnus captures on d6, c captures on d6, and now queen to e3, once again centralizing the queen, asking black, what do you want to do? So Carlsen will probably double up rooks on the c file and try and take advantage of the only open file on the board, that is the c file. And there's also the matter of somehow activating this bishop. With all of these pawns on dark squares, the bishop will not have all that much to do. So here Radjabov kind of makes it easy for Magnus. He plays g5, and this, if anything, allows Magnus to use this move in the future to maybe free up his dark square bishop. So here he plays rook to c3, now ready to double up on the c file, and queen to e8. Here Radjabov just attacks the a4 pawn, and Magnus doubles up on the c file. He ignores this pawn, but rook to c7 right away was also very, very interesting. Point is that if, well, if you don't want to allow something like rook captures here, and you play rook to d7, we can simply trade here, and after queen captures, there's this d captures on e5, so you will not be able to capture. Bishop captures with check, and your entire position falls apart. So after this wonderful rook to c7 move, you're not going to be able to play something like rook to d7. You're going to have to figure out a way out of this position, probably queen captures on a4, and then we'll get a similar position. But it is possible to go for this rook lift right away. Magnus first doubles up on the c file, and now Radjabov grabs the pawn on a4. Knight to e7 is always better, but that's only because we know that now. Queen captures on a4, Radjabov grabbed the pawn, and now rook to c7. Now Magnus has a lot of pressure on the position. Queen back to e8, bringing the queen back to help out with the defense, and now h4. Magnus, of course, wants to open up the position here, or if Radjabov captures on h4, which happened in the game, then queen to h6. Now Magnus is threatening checkmate here, but Radjabov doesn't mind. Just queen to g6, offers a queen trade, and defends on h7. So queen captures on h4 by Magnus, and now knight to a7. This is the absolute best way to go. You have to give up the pawn to activate your knight. So rook captures on b7, now knight to b5, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. So d captures on e5, finally d captures on e5, still this bishop without all that much to do, and king to g2. Now Magnus has some ideas of shifting this rook over to h1 to have a very nice attack against the h7 pawn. So rook d to e8 by Teimour, and now comes rook to c6. The point is, if you go rook to h1 now, going after this pawn, you can simply block rook to f7, and it's not a problem. So Magnus lifts the other rook as well. Rook to c6 puts pressure on this pawn. Also, if this rook was not here, and it's a good thing that it is, then bishop captures on e5 would be an idea. The a6 pawn is hanging, so what do you play here? Here, Teimour played knight to d4. Puts pressure on the rook here, and Magnus just captures on a6. But again, doubling up here definitely has its merits because it's not easy to defend this. There's a triple attack on the pawn here, and if you try something like h6, there's even the idea of queen to h5. You could offer a queen sacrifice, and if it's accepted, then there's this very nice checkmate here. So of course, Teimour would not capture the queen here. He would have to play something like rook to g8, but then we go into this rook to h7 check. He would have to give up the queen. King captures, and then queen to f7 check, where the f6 pawn falls, and after king h8, queen captures with check. And now this pawn will fall once the king unpins, and this pawn is very weak, so this should be winning for white. But okay, Magnus grabs the a6 pawn first. Why not create a beautiful passed b pawn? And now knight to e6 by Teimour. Now the knight can come to f4, so you have to be very careful. Rook to a7 now with a triple attack on the h7 pawn, and h5. Teimour just advances it, and now it's already move 34, so you should really consider pushing that past pawn. Pawn to b4, always a great move. But Magnus first decides to unpin. He plays king to f1, and now the bishop can finally move. We have rook to a8. Teimour has to eliminate some of the attackers from the 7th rank, and Magnus now, of course, doesn't trade rooks. He goes for the queen. Rook to h7 check. Queen captures, we have rook captures, and king captures. And it's a similar position to what we had, only now we grab the h5 pawn as well. This comes with check, king to g7, and now f4. So Magnus has a queen for 2 rooks, and also he's up 2 pawns for the moment. So here Radjabov captures. We have queen to g4 with check. Now you have to defend the knight. So king f7, and now bishop captures on f4. And now Teimour very gladly trades here because it's much easier to just counter the queen with 2 rooks than with a queen and an additional piece. It would be better for Magnus if it was a queen and knight, but queen and bishop can also be deadly. So knight captures, queen captures, and now rook f to e8. And now Magnus is up 2 pawns, but it's very hard to go through those rooks. However, Teimour is only down to 1 minute on the clock. Here, when Magnus played queen to f5, Magnus had some 10 minutes on the clock, whereas Radjabov had 1 minute on the clock. So he has to play very fast. King to g7. Once the rook moves, you do not want to allow something like pawn push and then, just losing this pawn. And you also have to have your rooks protected. You do not want to allow, for example, this rook moves here, we deliver a check, and then, we either pick up this rook or we somehow connect to this rook. That would be very unfortunate. So here we have f4 by Magnus, again, waiting with this b4 move, and rook to e7 now. We have queen to g4 check, king to f8, and now queen to h4. Now kind of putting pressure on the rook here and preparing this e5 move. And Radjabov makes it possible for Magnus. He just repeats king to g7, and now Magnus does push e5. And now, how do you block this? Well, you could do something like rook to a6, or you could do rook to f8. Radjabov chooses to bring the rook to f8, closer to the black king. So it will be easier to defend them, and you will not have to worry all the time about Magnus delivering some check and picking up the rook. And now, only now on move 48 does Magnus push the pawn to b4. Now, is this a winning pawn push? Let's see what happens. You could also consider, instead of playing b4, just improving the position of your king, but it's been way too long. We have to push the b pawn. So king to g8, Radjabov waits to see what Magnus does, and now comes queen to g3 with check. Here, b5 right away definitely has its merits, and the engine even agrees that it's winning, but Radjabov is very low on the clock, and Magnus does not want to allow Teimour to use Magnus's time to calculate his move. So he plays queen to g3 check, rook to g7, and now queen to b3 with check, putting the queen behind the passed pawn. We have king to h8, and now even e6. And now if f5 is played, then that's just over for Radjabov. So he plays f5, and now Magnus pushes the pawn to b5. And now we have a very critical moment, not a critical position, critical moment prior to the critical position, where Radjabov played rook to e7, puts pressure on the pawn here, and now the position is completely winning for Magnus, but you have to figure out how to achieve this. So feel free to pause the video and win the game for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting this incredible idea. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is not pawn to b6, unfortunately. That's what Magnus played, but that's not the winning idea. The winning idea is queen to b4. And now it's very much different, because now you force black to make a move. And what can black play here? Well, obviously, we could defend our rook like this, rook f to e8, and now we push b6. But now it's a different story, because now after rook captures on e6, we can simply play b7. And now after the rook stops the pawn from queening, now it's queen to d4 check, king to g8, and now queen to c4, pinning this rook. The king has to defend, king to f7 only move, and now queen to c7 check picks up the rook on b8. That's how it's done. Or another way, after, for example, b6 is played, you don't capture on e6, you play rook to b7, stop the pawn while it's still on b6, still doesn't help. Now we have queen to b2 check, king to g8, and now queen to g2 with check, again picks up the rook on b7. And yes, I know what you guys are thinking, these kind of endgames are that complicated. So after rook to e7, queen to b4, absolutely winning. It's always something with the b4 square, it just is, so I know most of you found it because of that. But Magnus played b6, and now he allows a very crucial tempo for Radjabov. He plays king to g7. And okay, we have queen to d5. Now if you advance the pawn, it's not a problem. We're just going to play rook to b8. Everything is nicely defended. Next move, we capture the pawn. So Magnus has to figure out a different way. He plays queen to d5, still keeping an eye on everything. If the rook moves, we can even pick up the f5 pawn, but king to g6 now. Teimour plays it with absolute precision. b7 by Magnus, and now rook to b8, guarding the queening square, and there's no good way for Magnus to connect any checks. So queen to g2 check was played, king f6, now queen to g5 check, king captures on e6, and now queen to g6 with check. So we're winning the f5 pawn, king to d7, queen captures with check, and now king to d6. And now the problem is, if you play something like queen to f6 check, we're just going to repeat king to d7. And now what do you play? There's really Not much you can do. So instead, Magnus tried queen to d3 with check. Now king to c7, queen to c4 check, hoping that Radjabov captures the b7 pawn. But if he does, this queen before check now wins the rook on e7. So Radjabov just moves back, king to d7. Now queen d5 check, king c7, queen c5 check, king d7, and now queen to d4 with check. There's no good check here that would pick up the rook. So king to c7, queen to c4 check, king to d7, and now f5. Magnus has to try whatever is left, but this means giving up the b7 pawn. So rook captures on b7, and now f6. Advancing the pawn. Rook to e5, played incredibly quickly, almost instantaneously, and again, it doesn't allow Magnus to connect anything. If this check, then king here, and the rook is nicely defended. We're attacking the pawn. So Magnus tried queen to g4 check, king to d6, now queen to g6 check, preparing some g6 discoveries, f7 discoveries, but now rook to b8. Again, Radjabov plays this instantly, and he doesn't care. If you deliver this check, king e7, there's nothing to connect here. You don't care about this. If king here going after the rook or something like this, we don't care. Just rook f5 check, we pick up the pawn, and that's it. So instead, queen back to d3 check, we have king to e6, now comes queen to a6 with check, king f5, now queen to d3 with check, again hoping for king captures on f6, then we can play queen to d6 check and win the rook on b8. Then of course the position is winning for white, but after queen to d3 check, Radjabov just repeated king e6, and now Magnus knows that there is nothing better. So queen a6, king to f5, queen to d3 check, and it was in this position on move 74 that Magnus and Teimour agreed to a draw, as there is nothing more to be done here. So a well-played continuation of the game, StockFish versus AlphaZero, and it was possible to go for the win here, but Magnus wanted to, even though he had 10 minutes on the clock, he just didn't want Teimour to use his own time to figure out moves, so he played it instantly, and then he missed that beautiful win with queen to b4 that all of you found. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Balkovich Enterprises, Ben McGreblian, Aaron Anderson, Garrett Myers, and Mark Adrian Fasse for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this amazing event, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.